Um, okay, and we're about 9 lines down. First one line is the Tanakama. Okay, just a little bit of background. 1 second. Okay, the Gemara was looking for a source that Girain Kesef, Pidyon, redemption is applicable to all types of slaves. And the Gemara has two possibilities. One is to learn from Omaha Ivriya or Nimkar La'akum, so a slave that's sold to a non-Jewish person. And we should say make a Gzera Shava called Socher. We're the Nimkar La'akum and a Nimkar Bezdin or Nimkar Atzmai, someone who's sold by the court or he sells himself, are also called a Socher. Therefore, they're equivalent to each other, and all of them can leave their slavery with Geroin Kesef, redemption. They can redeem themselves. Okay, the Gemara says there is an opinion that does not learn Socher. They reject that comparison. We'll soon see there really is no such. The Gemara cannot conclusively find such an opinion. But the presumption is that among the few examples the Gemara attempts, one of those opinions might hold that there is no such Gzera Shava. The Gemara's first attempt was to note 4 distinctions between a regular slave and a Nimkar Atzma and a Nimkar Bezdin according to the Tanakama. They have two completely different sets of rules. For example, a Nimkar Bezdin, the master can give a Shifra Kananis, and Nimkar Atzma he cannot. A Nimkar Bezdin he's obligated to give Hanokah. A Nimkar Hanokah is the gifts when the slave leaves. And a Nimkar Atzma, if he sells himself, the master is not obligated to give anything. A Moicher Atzma, if you sell yourself, it could be 6 years or more than 6 years. And Nimkar Bezdin is only for 6 years. And the final difference was that a Nimkar Bezdin is nirtza, his ear is drilled, and Nimkar Atzma his ear is not drilled. Why are these laws so distinct? It must be because we do not say Socher. Therefore, these laws are discussed by a Nimkar Bezdin, not by a Nimkar Atzma, and that is why a Nimkar Bezdin has these laws and a Nimkar Atzma does not. The Gemara rejects that. The Gemara says everybody agrees we do say Socher. Okay, now the question is, so why don't these laws apply to Nimkar Atzma? And the answer the Gemara is in the middle of describing is that each one has its own miyat, its own limitation. Specifically letting you know that the law applies to somebody who was sold as a robber by the court, Nimkar Bezdin, and not to a Nimkar Atzma. So the Gemara is continuing from where we left off yesterday. My time and Tanakama Atzma ein manikalei. When a slave leaves, you're supposed to give him gifts. According to the first opinion here, those gifts are only given by Nimkar Bezdin. Okay, why is it that it's only a Nimkar Bezdin, but a Nimkar Atzma, to Omar Meicher Atzma ein manikalei, there's no obligation to give him gifts. So Gemara says, there's a specific limitation. What's the limitation? Hanik tanik loy. These gifts should be given specifically to him, loy to the one who's sold by the court, but not to the slave who sells himself. The Idach and Rabbi Lazar, the second opinion that says they both get these gifts. What does he do with the word loy? The gifts of Hanukah do not go to his inheritors. So let's say he finishes his slavery and he dies, and the gifts weren't given yet. You don't give it to his kids. So the Gemara says, why don't they go to his kids? The Torah calls a slave an Nimkar Atzma a socher, a laborer. Just like a laborer, let's say he dies shortly after the culmination of his labor. The value of his labor goes to his kids. His salary will goes to his kids. So too, Afhai Pulos El Yarshav. So too the work of the gifts of the slave should go to his kids. Okay, so the Gemara says Elo, it means something else. When we talk about Hanaka, the gifts, the gifts go to him and not to to any debt that he has. So, for example, let's say the slave has $1,000 worth of debt, and you want to give him $1,000 worth of gifts. So, generally speaking, there's a rule, the law of Reb Nosson, which is that if I owe you and you owe him, then him can go collect from me, right? So, if I owe money to Reuven and Reuven owes money to Shimon, Shimon can come and collect it directly from me. But this is not true with regard to the gifts. Even though the master is giving the gifts to the slave's creditors cannot come and collect those gifts to pay up their own debt. Normally we hold like Reb Nosson. The Tanya we learned. How do we know that somebody who owes his friend money, and his friend owes his friend, right? So Reuven owes Shimon who owes Levi. You can collect money from. You can collect money. Levi can collect money directly from Shimon. You give it to the one who ultimately speaking he's indebted to, which is the creditor of his creditor. So therefore, the Torah says, these gifts do not go to pay for. They do not go to pay for the creditor. Okay, for idach, and what is the opinion of the rabbis? How do they know this concept? The rabbis don't agree with the opinion of Reb Nosson, and therefore, because they don't agree to the opinion of Reb Nosson, regardless, they would never have any reason to give it to the original creditor. I owe you, and if Reuven owes Shimon and Shimon owes Levi, the rabbis do not say that Levi has a right to collect from Reuven. Okay. What's the reason of the Tanakama that says somebody who sells himself, the master does not give him a shifra kananas? Okay, it's only by an imker bezdin where the master is able to give him a maidservant for reproduction. So the Gemara says, there's a limitation with regard to someone who is sold. The master will give him specifically as an imker bezdin, but not a meicher atzmei. The idach, and the other opinion, loy balkarchai. The master can give him a maidservant to sleep with, whether he likes it or not. In other words, part of his slave labor includes the fact that he has to sleep with whoever the master gives him. The idach, and the rabbi's opinion is, how do we know that he can be forced to fulfill his master's request in that regard? Because the Torah says he's worked the work of a laborer. The Tanya we learned because he's worked for you. And over here we say schar socher. He's the work of a laborer. It's a doubled phrase. Socher any ovid el b'yom. A regular laborer works by day. Every ovid bein b'yom bein b'layla. A slave works both by day and by night. Asks the Gemara, v'chisal al daitel shevet every ovid bein b'yom bein b'layla. Can you force your slave to work at night? But like for Namar, the Torah says kitov le'imach b'meichel imach b'mishta. The slave says that he wants to continue staying. Kitov le'imach because 1 second. No, I think this is 1 second. Yeah. When a slave has his ear drilled, so the reason why he's drilling his ear is because he wants to continue staying. Why does he want to continue staying? Because he says, because it's good to be with you. With you, what does with you mean? The slave is saying it's good to be with the master. That means that he's with the master when the master eats, with the master when the master drinks. The master sort of has to treat him as a friend invited to his table. Okay, if that's the case, then presumably he goes to sleep with the master also. he sleeps at the same time the master sleeps, and he doesn't work at night. Rav Yitzchak explains that what this means is, how does he work at night? The master can force him to sleep with an indentured maidservant, and that's part of his work at night. Okay, the idach and Rabbi Lazar that pasuk only would be a source that it is permitted to give him a maidservant. But how do we know that he can force him to sleep with her? So therefore, the Torah has to repeat itself that you can even that the master is entitled to force him. And according to Rabbi Lazar, we learn sachar, just like this is true with regard to an imkar bezdin, it's also true with regard to an imkar atzmi. Okay, so now that finishes the first attempt, searching for the opinion that says that does not learn sachar. But of course, we're not done yet. Okay, so who is the opinion that does not learn sachar? By the way, I just finished the Gemara yesterday, so the conclusion is that there is no definitive opinion. There is no definitive opinion. That there probably is an opinion, but it's not like we can definitively point to which opinion it is. All the Gemara's attempts could all be rejected. Okay, so what's the next attempt? Haitanahu. It's this opinion. Tanya v'shav mishpachtei. He goes back to his family. Amar B'Lazar ben Yaakov, the Mekos of Medaber. 1 second. Okay. V'shav mishpachtei here is discussing leaving on Yovel, and it's talking about a meicher atzmai. Even if we're talking about a meicher atzmai, the Torah already spoke about a meicher atzmai, and we'll discuss exactly the details. Even we're talking about someone's ear was drilled. The Torah already spoke about that. If he was sold by the court for being a robber 3 years before Yovel, Yovel frees him. The Isak if Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov held of sachar, Lomali, nail of sachar. Why does Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov seek a specific pasuk to tell me that a nimkar bezdin leaves on Yovel? Why doesn't he equate a nimkar bezdin to a nimkar atzmai? They're both called a sachar, and therefore should learn one from another that both of them leave on Yovel. Amr of Nachman Yitzchak, L'olam Sachar, L'olam Yalaf Sachar. Of course, he learned Sachar, obviously. It's necessary for the Torah to repeat itself 3 times that Yovel is a method of leaving. What are the 3 times? Number 1, Nimkar Atzmai, he sells himself. Number 2, Nimkar Bezdin, the court sells him. And number 3, Ritzia, where his ear is drilled. Someone who drills his ear, he works until Yovel comes. They're all necessary. Somebody who sells himself has not violated any law. He's not a robber. That's why he works until Yovel. But where the court sells him because he's a robber, the Avadi Surah, he's violated a law. Maybe we should penalize him and make him work the full 6 years. Anyone who's sold as a robber is sold for 6 years. So he should have to work the first full 6 years and not leave on Yovel. Kamash Malan. That's what the Torah has to say, that somebody who's a nimkar bezdin leaves on Yovel. Okay, so let's go back to the original statement of Rabbi Yaakov. Rabbi Yaakov makes the following claim: Amar Mar, Ibn Nirtzah. We're talking about someone whose ear was drilled. Nirtzah, Harek Faromer. The Torah already spoke about it. That Yovel makes him leave. Mahi, what exactly are we referring to? The Tanya we learn. The Shavtim Ishal Achuzasiv Ishal Mishpachtei. The people will go back to their families. This is talking about Yovel. What are we referring to? Even Mecharatz Meharek for Omer. Even Machru Bezdin Harek for Omer. Ain't a custom medaber ela benir tzashtayim v'shal shanim lefnei Yovel. Shal Yovel maitziyei. Okay. We've already established Meicher Atzmai leaves on Yovel. That's what this pasuk is directly referring to. Nimkar Bezdin, we said, is also included from this pasuk. How do we know that Ritzia is included in this? how do we know Ritzia? It's included in this pasuk as well. So the Gemara says, how do we know that it's included? Like, in other words, what about this pasuk tells me to include a Nirtzah, someone whose ear is drilled? This pasuk is not talking about a Nirtzah. It's talking about a Nimkar Atzmai. And we're also including indirectly a Nimkar Bezdin. How do we see in the pasuk that we're talking about drilling of the ear? My mashma, how do we see it? Ish. When we talk about an ish, a man who goes back to his family, what's unique about a man over a woman in terms of slavery? This is drilling of the ear, where we do not drill a woman's ear. So that's how we know that drilling of a nirtza is included in that pasuk as well. It's necessary for the Torah to write somebody who was sold by the court and somebody whose ear was drilled. If we talk about an imkar bezdin, mishum delema toy zimni. The reason why the Torah needs to say he leaves on Yovel is because his time has not come yet. It's only 2 years or 3 years into his sale, and he was sold for 6 years. But someone whose ear was drilled, that his time did come, maybe we should penalize him. 1 second. Okay. Now, okay. In other words, so a slave that's sold because he's someone who's sold because he was a robber. He's sold for 6 years. He leaves on Yovel. That the Torah says, even though it's before his time, he gets to leave. Now, a guy whose ear was drilled is always leaving after his time. His 6-year period was up years ago. What's happening? What's happening? He is. The Torah says now it's time for you to free him, because it's Yovel. Why do we now? If we remember, why exactly do we drill someone's ear? Because he forgets that he's a slave to God and not a slave to somebody else. He chooses to overstay his slavery, even though the reason for his difficulty is presumably gone because he sold himself for money, to stay on as a slave. So he violates his own perception of being a slave of God, of being an Eved Hashem. That's why he drills his ear. Well, maybe once we're doing that, maybe we should also punish him and make him stay forever, literally. So therefore, the Torah has to say, no, he leaves on Yovel. If the Torah would have just said that Nirtza leaves on Yovel, that's because he's fulfilled his basic obligation of 6 years. But someone who the court sold for a 6-year period and never served 6 years, maybe he should not leave on Yovel. It's necessary for the Torah to include him as well in leaving on Yovel. Okay. When you drill the guy's ear, the Torah says, I believe is the pasuk. Yeah, he will serve him forever. So it's necessary for the Torah to say he serves him forever, and it's also necessary for the Torah to say that he leaves on Yovel. Why? The Ikas Rahman al-Olam, if the Torah would say that a guy, a nirtza, someone whose ear was drilled, Havamina al-Olam mamish, al-Olam literally means until he expires. Kasav Rahman or V'shaftim. Therefore, the Torah says V'shaftim, that no, when Yovel happens, he goes back. The Ikas Rahman V'shaftim, Havamina Hayamina Hechad Levat Sheish. Av Hechad Levat Sheish, Lo Yehei Sefer Cham Mitchilasi. Mat Chilasi Sheish, Av Sefer Nami Sheish, Kamash Malan. Okay, if the Torah would just say that a nirtza leaves on Yovel, I would think that maybe a nirtza doesn't stay forever until Yovel. A nirtza actually stays another 6 years, just like his initial 6 years. Or Yovel, either one, whichever one comes first. So therefore, the Torah says, no, you stay la'olam. Once you drill your ear, you're giving up your life until Yovel. And when Yovel comes, that's when you leave. It's not just another 6-year period, it's another indefinite period, basically the period until Yovel. Okay, fine. So that was the second attempt of looking for somebody who definitively holds Sachar. However, that attempt was unsuccessful. Next attempt. Who's the opinion who's the opinion that disagrees about the concept of Sachar? So next attempt is Rebbe. It's for Rebbe. The Tanya we learned. We're on top of 15b, first word of the line. Okay. This is a discussion with regard to a nimkar la'akum. Nimkar la'akum is a slave that's sold to a non-Jew. Nimkar la'akum is specifically, the Torah says, there's a concept called ge'ulas krivim. The relatives, his uncle or his cousin will redeem him. Okay, or any or any one of his family redeems him. Okay, and if not, if he's not redeemed, then he leaves on Shnas HaYovel. He leaves on the 50th year. Okay, so this Gemara really will finish. Hopefully we'll finish it today. It's not exactly an easy Gemara. I guess if you were reading Chumash very simply, you probably would come to the following conclusion. You'd probably say that you're sold to a non-Jew. Anyone can redeem you. Anyone of your family can redeem you. And if you're not redeemed, you leave on Yovel. Obviously, this is presumably that the non-Jew is going to listen to your rules. This is obviously the non-Jew Shabbos guy that lives in Kiryas Yael. He follows all the Jewish rules. He's a non-Jew, but he lives in Israel, which is perfectly fine. Okay, now we'll soon see. However, it's complicated. There might be other opinions that are actually saying that something else is going on here. There really are two ways to be redeemed. You can be redeemed by family, or you can be redeemed by somebody else. And in one of those instances, we'll soon see which one. So in other words, it's Geulas Krivim and it's Geulas everybody. And in one of those scenarios, actually, they have a right to work the slave. The slave is not redeemed. He's moved from the non-Jew to the Jewish family who keeps him until Yovel. And that's what the pasuk is saying. So and actually, you might not leave the non-Jew Yovel. What you're leaving is your Jewish redeemer. You'll be leaving Yovel. Are we talking about the Jewish redeemer that is? Oh, so needs to get in. So the Gemara will deal with: are we dealing with the Jewish redeemer, or are we dealing with the? Or are we dealing with the or are we dealing with the slave that's still owned by the non-Jew? As who's leaving in Yovel? Is it the fact that the non-Jew is the Jew leaving the Jew who sold himself to the non-Jew, the Nimkar La'akum, is he leaving on Yovel? Or is it that he's leaving his Jewish redeemer on Yovel? We'll get to that in a moment. Okay. Okay, so if you don't redeem a slave in Nimkar La'akum Be'ela in these ways, what are these ways? Geulas Krivim, redeeming of the relatives. Rabbi says, Be'ela hu nigal be'ein nigal b'sheish. Somebody who sells himself to a non-Jew, Nimkar La'akum, does not leave after 6 years. He only goes out through Geulas Krivim, not through Geula. Not through 6 years. But it's a kavachomer. A regular Eved Ivri does not have Geulas Ela. He does not have Geulas Krivim. He has Geulas Atzmai. If he takes his own money that he received for selling himself, he can redeem himself. He does not have Geulas Krivim. His relatives can't redeem him. Yet he leaves after 6 years. I would think that a non-Jew that has Geulas Krivim also has Geulas Sheish. Talmud Loimer be'ela, be'elu nigel ve'ena nigel b'sheish. He specifically has Geulas Kroivim, but not 6 years. He does not leave after 6 years. If you hold of Sachar, why do you need to come onto a Kal V'chomer? Just say that they're identical because of Sachar. A Nimker La'akum is the same as a Nimker Atzmai. Just like a Nimker Atzmai leaves after 6 years, so too a Nimker La'akum should leave after 6 years. If not for the fact that the Torah says, in lo yigal ba'ela, your only method of redemption is the 6 years. Clearly here, Rebbe does not hold of the Sachar. Nachman says it's inconclusive. Rebbe does hold of Sachar. Wait a second here. When the Torah talks about Geulas Kroivim, the Torah says Geulas Kroivim. I'm sorry, my mistake. Made a mistake here. Let's go backwards. Again, the Gemara's question was not about the Kal V'chomer. The Gemara's question is, why don't we learn Geulas Kroivim of a Nimker La'akum to Nimker Atzmai? Why don't we say that just like a Nimker La'akum has Geulas Kroivim, Nimker Atzmai should also have Geulas Kroivim? The Gemara's resolution is no. By Geulas Kroivim, it says Geulas Kroivim of a Nimker La'akum. In other words, the relative is redeeming somebody who was sold to a non-Jew. The Torah says Yigalenu, they will redeem him, specifically him, but not somebody who sells himself as a slave. He does not have Geulas Kroivim. His relatives cannot redeem him. He can only redeem himself. Okay. And I think Gemara goes on a slight tangent. Montana the Polygalad Rebbe. Who's the opinion that disagrees with Rebbe? Rabbi Yosei Lili Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Yosei Lili Rabbi Kiva. Okay, so let's just review this quickly. So Rebbe says Geulas Kroivim works for a non-Jewish, a slave sold to a non-Jew, a Nimker La'akum. He has Geulas Kroivim, the relatives can redeem him. If the guy was not redeemed Geulas Kroivim, then what happens? V'yotza b'shnasa yovel, he leaves on yovel, meaning he leaves the non-Jewish family that owns him on the year of Yom. However, we'll see it's more complicated. Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Yosei Lili and Rabbi Kiva disagree. Tanya. He wasn't redeemed by relatives. If he's not redeemed by relatives, then in other words, if his relatives redeem him, then what happens? He goes free. However, if any other Jew redeems him from his non-Jewish servitudes, his non-Jewish master, l'shibud, they have a right to continue working him until the end of the 50 years. Rabbi Kiva says the opposite. If the relatives redeem him, then the relatives get to work him until Yovel. If anybody else redeems him, then they do not get to work him. He goes free immediately. My time in Rabbi Yosei. What's the reason of Rabbi Yosei? So now we said if you don't get redeemed with Geulas Kroivim, except that what happened, you got redeemed by somebody else, then v'yotzav shnasa yovel. That's the interpretation of Rabbi Yosei. The Gemara obviously is going to ask that this is not what the verse states. This is sort of an obvious question. Okay, so he wasn't redeemed by relatives. Instead, he was redeemed by a random guy. The random guy is v'yotzav shnasa yovel. He leaves on yovel, meaning obviously that the random guy is able to keep working him until yovel. Rabbi Kiva reads the pasuk that if he's not redeemed except by the previous verse with relatives, meaning the relatives redeemed him, so then he leaves in Shnasa Yovel, the relatives get to work him until Yovel. Okay. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yosei Lili Midi Ela Be'elaksiv. I'm sorry, the verse states if he was not redeemed with Ela, with these things, then he goes out in Yovel, meaning he wasn't redeemed at all, period. He leaves the non-Jewish slave on Yovel. The verse doesn't say somebody else redeemed him. Okay. So the Gemara says you're right. This is not the source. They're disagreeing on a different verse. Or his uncle, Ben Doidai, or his son of his uncle, his cousin, Yigalena will redeem him. Zeg Ulas Kroivim. Or he's able to afford it. Zegulas atzmai. That's a reference to him redeeming himself. V'nigal, and he'll be redeemed. That last reference is Zugu Ulas Acherim. That is the redemption of somebody else, a random stranger. Rav Yosef Lili Savar, Rav Yosef Lili holds Mikra Nidrush Lefanov. Okay, the verse is learned on the previous subject. We'll explain. The middle item here is Geulas Atzmai. Geulas Atzmai, if he redeems himself, obviously he's now free. He's not indentured to himself. That doesn't make any sense. If you learn the verse on what it's written previously, Shadi Geulas Krayv Geulas Atzmai, then you learn the law of Geulas Atzmai, him redeeming himself, is learned also on the redemption of relatives. Just like when he redeems himself, he goes free. So to when relatives redeem him, he also goes free. Ma Geulas Atzmai l'shechor, af Geulas Krayv l'shechor. Okay, Rabbi Kiva says, the verse is learned on the latter statement. The last statement is v'nigal, he's redeemed. He's redeemed by who? A random stranger. So you put the redemption of a stranger relating to the redemption of himself. And we say, magulas atzmai, just like his own redemption, l'shechor, is freedom. Afgulas acherim l'shechor. So too, Geula's redemption of somebody else is also for freedom. He cannot require him to work. Okay, so the Gemara says, Ihachi. 1 second. Ihachi be'ela lamali. Why does the Torah need to say if he's not redeemed with Elah? In other words, the key here is that he leaves on Yovel, except the one that's comparable to Geulas Atzmai. In other words, the Gemara here is taken for a given that Yovel will be, that you will continue to work for whoever redeems you, except that one of you, meaning either Geulas Krevim, the redemption of a relative, or redemption of a stranger, one of those is compared to Geulas Atzmai, redemption of himself, which allows him to become free. So why does the verse need to continue and say, if that redemption didn't happen, then he leaves in Yovel? I already know that. That's a given. The only question is which one is excluded from that category. So the Gemara says, Ila be'ela, if not for the word be'ela, havamina, I would think mikra nidrush bein lefana bein la'akra, v'akol shecher. If not for the word be'ela, I would think that both are included, both the beginning and the end, both whoever's first and whoever's second. And everybody goes free. And therefore, be'ela says, no, only one of them is included. Either Geulas Atzmai, either Geulas Acherim, or Geulas Krevim. Okay. So, Ihachi hadr kushla duchte. If that's the case, so now Be'ela is a limitation, but Be'ela doesn't tell you which to limit. Be'ela doesn't tell you whether to read the verse on whether to compare Geulas Krevim to Geulas Atzmai, or to compare Geulas Acherim to Geulas Atzmai. One of them is excluded, but doesn't tell you which one. And it's back to the original question: which one is Be'ela teaching you? And obviously, as we asked in the beginning, the Torah doesn't really specify. It's not clear which one is included in Be'ela, in these methods. Which of these methods? Geulas Acherim or Geulas Atzmai or Geulas Krevim? Okay, Ela b'svar kamifli. It's a debate in logic. Rabbi Yosef Glili savar mistaver Geulas Acherim l'shibud. Rabbi Yosef Glili says that when somebody else redeems you, it makes sense that you should have to work for them. The Amrit l'shechor, because you're going to say that you go free, have a mimni v'lei parki. Nobody would redeem him. So therefore, make him work for the stranger that redeemed him, and presumably you'll have a lot of strangers that are willing to redeem him. Rabbi Kiva says, "Mistaver Geulas Krevim l'shibud." It makes sense that redemption of a relative is for labor. The relative can continue to make him work. Because if you'll say the redemption of relatives allows the man to go free, then there's a risk factor. The man will constantly sell himself because he knows his relatives will always redeem him and he won't have to work. So therefore, we allow his relatives to continue to work. Okay. So that concludes the discussion between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yossi. Whether or not Geulas, according to them, there's a distinction between Geulas Krayv and Geulas Acherem. One of them says that Geulas Krayv, redemption of the relatives can work him. And the other opinion says Geulas Acherem, when somebody else redeems him, that other person, a stranger, is able to redeem him, is able to continue to make him work. But each one disagrees about the other one. Amar of Chia bar Abba, Amar of Yechanan, Zudi of Rabbi Yossi, Aglili of Rabbi Kiva. So Rabbi Yechanan says this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Kiva. Al Chachamim Ba'amrim Hakol Shechor. Everybody, both Geulas Krayvim and Geulas Acherim, both of them are freed completely when they're redeemed from non-Jewish slave ownership. Man Chacham, who's the Chachamim? Rebbe He did Mapik Lalahai Be'ela L'Drosh Achrono. It's the opinion of Ela that he uses Ela for a completely separate point. In other words, according to Rebbe, Be'ela tells me that a slave sold to a non-Jew does not leave after 6 years. A regular slave leaves after 6 years. Slave sold to a non-Jew does not leave after 6 years. He leaves on Yovel. And therefore, we compare both Geulas Krayvim and Geulas Atzmai, Geulas Krayvim and Geulas Acherim to Geulas Atzmai. Just like when he redeems himself, he goes out free. So too, when either a relative or a stranger redeems him, he also goes out free. What does Rabbi do with this? Is sort of obvious. It's not really a question at this point in the Gemara. It's the Gemara really previously mentioned it. According to Rabbi, what does it mean he goes out in Yovel? It means literally that he leaves on Yovel. Are we talking here about the non-Jewish slave owner who owns a Jewish slave? Is he under our control or is he not under our control? So, the obvious answer is Amrit. It must be if he's not under our control, why would he listen to us? If we have a non-Jew who lives in our country, so therefore he must obey our laws. When he buys a Jewish slave, that Jewish slave leaves on Yovel, quite literally. So according to Rebbe, the Yatzav Yovel is referring to directly to the Jewish slave leaving his non-Jewish ownership. Okay, stop here. Have a great day. Did I lose today?
Yes, your clock. Make it a great day, Rabbi.
Yeah, these are very difficult. Very difficult. That's not too good.